put it with you first. And then
All right. Is this on? Good evening, everyone. You made it. All right. I was worried that people were going to be in Ballard, sitting at Peddler right now, having their first beer, wondering to themselves, where the heck is everyone? So those people will be here in about 40 minutes via Uber, so we'll let them walk in. I want to start by acknowledging Miranda for all the work she put into this, and also acknowledging you guys for how important this discussion really is, and for thanking the panelists for being here. I mean, this is big. We can't understate that. Not only is our discussion tonight on homelessness key to the health of our city, but literally to our democracy, and that's not hyperbole right there. We are gathered in a productive, respectful discussion around a diverse set of ideas that just being here is noble and courageous and humble to listen in our own right. And so I want to thank you. I'm inspired to be here, and I think it's going to be a great discussion. As Miranda mentioned, my name is Carson Bolin. I recently just started a new business here in Seattle and have been serving as the vice chair of the Young Professionals Board for this past year. The Washington Policy Center, we focus as a statewide entity. We're a think tank, free market ideas. We're committed to creating a forum for open discussion that's civil and focused on results. And so I think that you're going to hear that through both the questions and the dialogue and the focus throughout tonight. So thank you for being here, panelists. We're going to start out, we've been kind of using a trend over the last couple events about focusing on one word to start with, and that's, what is your why? So each of you on the panel dedicate a significant amount of time to solving homelessness in our community, and it's a noble pursuit. So if you guys could each take a minute to introduce your guys' selves, talk about where you spend your time on the issue, and then also what is your why? Let's start with Amber.
Hi, my name is Amber Matthai. If you guys watched Seattle's Dying, I had like a 2 seconds to tell the Seattle Council members what I thought. Anyway, a little bit of background of my why. I'll start with my why first. Growing up, my father was a heroin addict. I ran into him in the streets in high school. Ironically, I guess, on my way to my high school graduation, I saw him on the side of the road. He lived under 405 in Rankin with his girlfriend at the time. He's now in an adult home care facility, and he has alcohol and drug-induced schizophrenia and dementia. I don't know if you guys have had experience with that, but it means most of his mental faculties are no longer there and needs to be cared for 24/7. In addition to that, I've had a lot of experiences finding family members in the system. So not only my dad, but his brother and sister also have drug-related mental issues. So my uncle's now in a home care facility, but he was at Western State. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Western State, but they actually lost their federal funding, and they were paying $3 million per month back to the government for not being in compliance due to a lawsuit. So there are some systemic issues that got me involved initially. I work downtown. I catch the bus on 3rd and Pine, and so I see people that have a lot of mental health issues and a lot of substance abuse issues on my way to work. And so it's reached a tipping point where we need to start doing something because obviously, and some people can disagree with me, that's fine. Our leaders are not, their means to an end is not working. The problem is getting worse. And so that's why I'm here. What else was I supposed to say?
Oh, that's great.
Okay.
All right.
Great.
Chris, you're up.
Sure. All right. Good work. So yeah, I'm here. I think it started out with just a personal experience. I imagine that many of you have had similar experiences when you're taking your kid to school and you get chased into the middle of the intersection and you see kind of problems after problem after problem that deal with this nexus of homelessness, addiction, crime, mental illness. And I just felt like, as a citizen, some frustration and also tremendous amount of compassion for people who are obviously really suffering. And then outrage and frustration at a political system that seems to be unwilling to confront the problem directly, and I think has demonstrated a utopian vision of compassion, and then when it translates into reality over time, a record of failure. And I wanted to understand why. That set me off on a journey to do some research. And I think that one of the biggest problems, and this came up even before this event as we organized it, is that we have, this is kind of my more abstract interest in it, is that we have a kind of intellectual and ideological monoculture that is strictly enforced. And I think that it's in everyone's best interest. I think arguments and ideas get stronger the more they're tested. We're at a startup incubator, right? What's the first thing you do in a startup incubator? You dump on the guy's idea until it gets stronger and it works. And I think in Seattle...
Don't dump on my new business. So just...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how it works. So, and I think that for some reason, we have some of the most brilliant business leaders that do this every day. But when we translate into politics, it's like we can't have a disagreement, an argument, or conflict, even though those are the exact elements that are required to make ideas stronger. So I personally would like to inject a little bit more of that. And even if you don't agree with my idea, that's fine. But I think that even, let's say, an opposing idea gets better and stronger the more it's tested. And I think that that's really my personal mission, is to try to investigate from an intellectual and political standpoint and philosophical standpoint some of the flaws in the current kind of ideological consensus, and try to break it apart until it becomes better, until it becomes functional, and until we can see actual, tangible, concrete results. Because I don't accept that what we're doing is compassionate in any way. I think it actually, you just see it over and over every day, the amount of people that are suffering, and we seem to be accepting it. But I know that there is the public that doesn't. And I want to also articulate a vision for a majority of the public that doesn't feel represented with the current ideas that are in play.
All right. Thanks. Sarah, would you like to grab?
Sure. I'm Sara Rankin. I'm an associate professor of law at Seattle University School of Law, where I also direct the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project. And sadly, I've been doing one thing and one thing only for the last 10 years, and that's studying how our laws and policies can make homelessness better or worse. And so why am I here? I'm here for two reasons. The first is I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that everybody in this room shared a mutual interest. And I think we do share a mutual interest, which is ending homelessness and human suffering. I think that's something that all of us want. So it's not a question of whether we should end homelessness and human suffering. The question is, what's the most humane and cost-effective way to do it? And so to me, I think that that's an important focus in terms of my participation in the discussion tonight, is to keep us focused on that mutual interest. The second reason why I'm here is because of some of the polarization that Chris was talking about. Even though we share that mutual interest, we sort of suck at working at it, right? We have a problem coming up with that focus on cost-effective solutions. We resist. I think a lot of that comes from, and Carson, you and I talked about this, it takes a lot of work to become educated about what those cost-effective solutions are, and to remain educated about what those cost-effective solutions are. It's so much easier to just lean on the crutch of emotional responses or ideological responses. And so I'm here because I hope I can urge us all to resist the pull, that siren song of turning back to an emotional response, and instead to really stay focused on what is proven to work.
Chad Mackay. I run a company called Fire and Vine Hospitality. We're a restaurant group in the Northwest, 13 operations, El Gaucho Aqua, a whole series of stuff. We have about 700 employees. So this panel is not my day job. However, I was born here, raised in Renton, and care a lot about the city. And the reason I'm here is because last year, a couple of things happened. There was a real big political divide around a political tax, an issue that I was opposed to. And at the same time, I had my two boys were biking to school about 3 miles a day, come home with these fantastical stories. And at first I was like, oh, come on, that's not really happening. And then, oh yeah, I read about the Fremont Bridge burning, this whole thing. And I came home one day and my kids are playing homeless camp downstairs. And I'm like, okay, so I'm opposed to this thing and my kids are doing this. My parents taught me, like, if you're gonna bitch about something, you better be willing to do something. And at the same time, Sara came and talked to a group called Visit Seattle, which is the marketing and promotion organization that promotes the convention center and visitors to this market. I've been on that board for 13 years. And the reason I got involved is she actually gave me hope that we could do something about chronic homeless, that we could do something about the costliest part of homelessness. And that was the first time I had actually experienced hope where data mattered, evidence mattered, and that didn't have to be polarizing. It actually could be something where we could join together, collaborate, and look. And out of that came Third Door Coalition. So
Great.
She kind of got me into this. We've been a big UGM supporter for years, been out on the midnight runs. We started campaigning and fundraising for the Women and Children's, the original one getting built. We also helped them do their first fundraiser for the gala that they had never done before. And in work with Sara and then the whole slew of people around the city, it was how do we engage, how do we collaborate, and how do we look at things? And how do we have a conversation that isn't an or conversation? You're either for or against, you're this or that. Let's have an and conversation. And at the end of the day, that's the conversation I want to have tonight.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for that. Sara, let's jump to you. So
You're back.
you are back.
I just want to say these chairs are height biased because I feel like a kid. I can't reach. Yeah, I just want to point out I'm feeling really insecure right now with my feet sort of like swinging back and forth. But thank you
You could
for
grab
letting
one
me
of
say that.
these chairs and
Yeah,
slide
it would
them
be
on
more height appropriate.
So homeless populations in Seattle are not one single homogenous group. And you and I had an 1.5 hour long conversation, and I learned a ton through that. Can you help us, just to set the stage for the rest of the conversation, paint a picture of that nuance that we described within that group?
Yeah, sure. One of the biggest problems we have, one of the biggest obstacles we have in making progress with respect to homelessness is our imprecision in how we talk about it. So the conversation that Carson and I had, he said, well, what are the main causes of homelessness? And I said, which type? And so that's one of the big problems that we have is for most people, when you think of homelessness, you're actually not thinking of homelessness writ large, the larger homeless population. You're thinking of a specific subgroup within the overall homeless population that is a much smaller part of our overall homeless population. That is people who are chronically homeless, who are unsheltered and chronically homeless. The reason this matters is not only because the causes for chronic homelessness differ than, say, the causes for single-family homelessness, but people who are chronically homeless, literally by definition, have to be two things. First, they have to be homeless more frequently and for longer periods of time. Second, they have to suffer from a disabling condition that prevents them from working. And there's qualifying disabling conditions. Some of the ones that Amber mentioned would fall into that category. Severe untreated mental illness, a chronic health problem, substance abuse disorders fall into that category. So it's that the presence of that qualifying disability that helps to explain the persistence of their homelessness. And I think that's really key for us to understand, because when we lob out terms, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, maybe we should use rapid rehousing. Has anybody heard rapid rehousing or affordable housing? Those are all great things for some parts of homelessness, but it's never going to make a difference with respect. I shouldn't say never. It will make a not to you noticeable difference with respect to chronic unsheltered homelessness. So we know what the main drivers are for chronic unsheltered homelessness, and we know what the most cost-effective solutions are, but we don't tend to invest in them. We tend to sort of smatter around the investments in other areas. So that precision in terminology is important.
Yeah, I think that distinction was new to me, and that was pretty revealing. Amber, pivoting from that, talking about the chronic homeless populations that you've interacted with in Licton Springs, and then also talking about some of the personal ties you have. Can you share some of the anecdotes that you'd shared with me, specifically maybe about Adrian Diaz as well?
Yeah, so that's like a three-part question, but
I'll keep it on track.
That's fine. So I am a resident of Licton Springs. I think 2 years ago, the city put in the first of its kind low barrier encampment. So what that meant that the whole point of low barrier is to have people who are hard to put into shelters because they're either active users, they have partners, they have pets, for whatever reason. And so the city said, for these 2 years, we're going to place these people on Aurora. I don't know how much you guys know about Aurora, but it is a drug trafficking, sex trafficking avenue, especially near 85th and Aurora. And so from my view, you're putting a very vulnerable part of your population literally in probably one of the worst areas in the city, and you're trying to help them. Instead, what you create is a hotbed for crime, because pimps and drug dealers have all of their consumers in one spot. They don't have to go anywhere. And so what happened, anecdotally, I've been in the neighborhood now for 8 years. I noticed a tremendous increase in crime in my neighborhood. What I do for a living, I didn't mention it previously, I'm a business intelligence analyst. What that means is I crunch big data all the time, every day. So I went to SPD's database and I was like, all right, let's see if what I'm experiencing anecdotally is backed up in the data. Turns out I couldn't do that because the data was bad. So I worked with Sean Whitcomb and Mark Bridge from SPD to get their database cleaned up. In the interim, they ran numbers for me from the non-corrupt part of their database. And so it turned out that there's a 103% increase in crime year over year in a census-containing block. So that's a 2-block radius. Right, and so my neighbors and I, right, we're not just noticing this increase anecdotally. There is, you can't say it was causation, too many variables. And because I don't have access to the data, I couldn't tell you how strong the correlation was, but that's fine. So it turns out that part of the requirement for the city to put this low barrier encampment in and to keep it at the 2-year max is the impact on crime in the community, right? Because we want to create a win-win situation. And I'd argue that if you're putting a very vulnerable population in a high crime area, like you're doing no one favors. Anyway, so there's that. And then what was the...
So I'm actually...
Keep me on track.
Yeah, I'll have Chris jump in on this now. So you were able to be a person of action, pairing your professional work into a really into an area of need in our city. Chris, can you talk about the political ramifications? So why was that camp placed there versus in Laurelhurst or do you want to talk about that?
I could actually probably talk to that.
All right,
yeah.
You guys can,
so it turns out that Lehigh, the Low Income Housing Institute, owned the property on Aurora. And so they worked out an agreement with the city to run the financial operations, and then Share Wheel ran the everyday operations. I don't know if you want to add more to that, Chris.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really good point. I think one of the things that I really wanted to figure out first is, what are some of the big assumptions that we have that we aren't testing? And a couple of things that jump to mind, and then I'll get to that exact question. But you'll hear from a lot of people that homelessness is a national crisis. Anyone heard that? Put your hand up. Okay. What you probably don't know, that according to the federal government, homelessness is actually down 16.7% nationwide over the last 10 years. Then you'll hear, well, it's a problem that's in every state. But what you don't know is that in the last 10 years, again, it's down in 35 out of 50 states. Then you say, well, it's a really complex problem that is hitting the entire Puget Sound, right? Okay. Well, you see in the city of Seattle's own data that 51% of the people who are homeless in the city of Seattle came from outside the city limits, and that's almost certainly an understatement. Because when you dig into the individual level data, you find a high preponderance of last known addresses in one zip code where the services and the DESC and the county jail are. So I think conservatively it's an underestimation. We don't know how much. So you see a couple things that actually we act like this is a problem that no one has solved. But many states, and then nationwide, it's actually been trending down. While at the same time, in the last 5 years, it's up 131% here in Seattle, the number of unsheltered people. That might not be exactly right. They changed the methodology, but we know that it is likely more than doubled. So we have to assume that we're doing something wrong. And the talking points from the city in their PR campaign, #SeattleForAll, was that, I mean, like it's straight out of a science fiction book from the Cold War. It's, we're making progress and proven solutions are working. And it's like, test that against anyone's reality. People do not believe that. And I think that the data and the evidence goes to support that. So what do? I did another study where I did a public records request for every citizen complaint in 2018 about encampments, needles, trash, human feces, and biohazardous waste. And I mapped them on a map, and I found something very interesting. There were more than 2,000 complaints about homeless encampments last year. There were 4 neighborhoods that reported no complaints whatsoever. You guys could probably guess which ones, right? Broadmoor, Madison Park, Laurelhurst, and what's the one above Laurel? Windermere, right? Why is that? I think again, this is just kind of applying common sense to it. But my suspicion is this: Broadmoor is a gated community, right? That's kind of that's probably explains a lot of that. The other 3 hired private security to basically do extremely localized community policing and enforcing low-level property crimes. Basically saying, anytime a tent comes up, anytime someone comes in, they're up to no good, politely but firmly, hey, excuse me, you can't do that, keep moving. That's actually exactly what Bellevue does, and many other cities that don't have the same problems. So when you hear, we don't know what to do, the reaction is then to lower the standards. Well, let's decriminalize, the problem is so bad, let's decriminalize public camping. That was a bill that went to the legislature this year. Let's decriminalize drug crimes, low-level property crimes. We basically, in many places, we're not really enforcing shoplifting laws. But when you have an imbalance, right, if you did that nationwide, you might be able to argue, well, it's kind of spread out, there wouldn't be a big effect. But when you localize it, you create an imbalance, a policy baseline imbalance. You're creating a series of incentives that work. There's a reason why in some places homelessness is going down, in others it's going up. And even the last King County homelessness czar admitted that there is a magnet effect. So in effect, like Union Gospel Mission, I love those folks. You can see how they transform lives, but until we fix the political problem, the policy problem, until we create a baseline that changes the incentives so that we're not doubling our homeless population just by essentially incentivizing people to come, I think until we fix that, it's like bucketing water out of a boat at the same time you're punching holes in the bottom. And I think that's really the fascinating question. And I think that the evidence, to me, supports that conclusion. And I think that if you talk to the people that deal with it on the law enforcement side, there is no one more frustrated in the city of Seattle than an SPD beat cop. These are guys that know exactly what's going on. I talk to them. I talk to the fire department. I've built a very close relationship with many of those folks, and they say, what we see on the ground and the ideological ideas coming out of our leadership's mouths are on two different planets. And I think that we need to try to bridge that gap and try to have those disagreements. Sometimes it is perhaps an either or, and make some harder choices, adjust the incentives, adjust the policy environment so that our incredible nonprofits, our incredible service providers, our incredible and generous citizens can actually start making a difference. And to go back to that, it's like you have to also see, where do they put low barriers encampments? Where do they put safe injection sites? Within the rhetoric of social and racial justice, this is incredible to me. They always put these places in the poorest communities, in the communities with the highest percentage of people of color, and in the communities with the highest percentage of people who do not speak English as their first language. So I think we need to measure compassion not by inputs, not by our good intentions, not by how much money we're spending, which according to the Business Journal is now $1 billion a year in King County. Probably a little less than that. They got a little excited on that one. And then not by how good we feel as voters or citizens, but by actually getting people off the streets into housing and having the chance for a better life. And I think perversely, we're actually lowering the bar for people that have more potential.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a good transition. Do you want to pick up right there on housing and talk about some of the housing options that we've discussed?
I would like Chad to speak about the housing piece, but I do just want a second to respond to Chris's points. There's a lot that Chris said that I disagree with and that I would like to give you the evidence, but ultimately we're just going to be trading barbs back and forth about the evidence that exists. This is that point where I have to come back to you and say, it will take some work from you to actually look at the evidence and evaluate it for yourself. And if you need assistance with that, I'm sure Chris would be happy to give you his evidence. I would be happy to give you my evidence. But there's also a lot of what Chris said I agree with. And that's, I think, the more important point is, and it was the last thing Chris said, it wasn't the only thing, but it was the last thing Chris said, which is that we need to take people off the street and put them into housing. And I fully complete, full-throated, full-hearted agreement with Chris on that point, and we need to do a better job of it, and that's what Chad will talk about.
Perfect. Chad, I'm going to cue you up with a question I had that is a good stage for this. So during our pre-meeting, you shared a couple of things that really resonated with me. The first was you said it's cheaper to solve problems than manage them, and I think that that's a reflection of a lot of what Chris is talking about as well. And then the second was a Jeffersonian tradition that you spoke about, where you can disagree with people, still be friends, and get things done together. And that's what you and Sara have sought out to do. And so can you talk about the work that you are attempting and working towards at the Third Door Coalition?
Yeah, so I think for the first one, where it could be cheaper to solve something than just to manage it, I think we're in agreement with Chris in the sense that you need to house people. Leaving them on the street, putting them into low barrier encampments, doing tiny houses, those aren't solutions. More shelters are not solutions. And so that article that I referenced was Malcolm Gladwell writing that in 2003, where he basically does a study of a gentleman named Murray in Denver, where they basically calculated the cost of a chronically homeless person that was on the streets of Denver that everybody knew. Every police officer knew, every emergency room physician knew, the nurses, the caseworkers, the social workers. And he tallied it up and he's like, cost $1 million for Denver to keep that guy on the street. They could have housed him easily, wrapped services. Even if he continued to be an alcoholic, all of those things, it would have been cheaper. The fiscal conservative me is like, why aren't we doing something more cost effective than what we're doing now, spending maybe not $1 billion, but clearly a lot of money? And so when we get to that, if you look at supportive housing, which is bringing people off the streets that are chronically homeless, wrapping them with services and giving them the opportunity to build a better life versus staying on the streets where they've been there for 10, 20 years. It's a way more cost effective. Just forget the humanitarian aspect for a minute, just from the numbers, it's a way more cost effective. To put somebody in permanent supportive housing is the same cost as 3 days at Harborview. It's the same cost as 3 months in jail. It's the same cost as running a 24-hour shelter for a bed to house somebody and give them a place where they might belong and build their life. I too grew up in a family where my dad was an alcoholic. He's been sober 43 years, which has been fantastic. He's had a lot of friends that never made it. And he always had compassion because he's like, I could have been that person in the gutter, right? If I didn't have somebody that lifted me up and made something happen, and he still sponsors, he still does those things. So to help people rebuild lives, part of it is you got to bring them in. It's inhumane leaving people in these camps. It's not even, and then it's totally fiscally irresponsible. We're talking about chronic homeless. And so that's the part of it could be cheaper. And it's a great article, by the way. It's 15 years old and it's relevant to today. Cheaper to solve than to manage. We manage for the most part. There are some people that do solve. Second part is Jeffersonian dinners. So again, when I met Sara was presenting, she's like a homeless right advocate, right? She's
get along very well.
Yeah, I mean, like she's usually suing the business improvement areas around, Panhandle. I mean, all this kind of stuff. Constitutional attorney. It's like, oh, the Constitution thing. It's like, sometimes it gets in the way of people's rights. But this idea that you can actually have a disagreement with people, and so we participate in Jeffersonian dinners, where it's like, hey, we take a topic around things that we disagree with. And yet by sharing, breaking bread, having a little wine, having conversation and understanding where the other person is, I mean, you may not change my mind, but I'm going to understand way more about your position. And together we might actually bridge something. And that is really where Third Door is let's focus on chronic homeless. Let's focus on one element that's 29% of the population. It's about 4,000 individuals within King County that fit the definition. They've been on the streets for a year or more. They've got secondary disabling conditions, right? That's the group that we're actually really talking about. That's the group that the neighborhoods are upset about. Do we like what we're doing right now? No. Every data set that we've seen, every study, and Sara was the one who's like, go look, right? I'm a data-driven person. I'm evidence-based. I don't care about politics. I care about policy. I care about data, not drama. Was to look at evidence and say it's cheaper to house people that are in this state. By the way, their average age is 55 years old. They've been on the streets for more than a year. They're white males. They don't tug at your heartstring. And for those that are around personal responsibility, which was me, the story is not great. And yet, from a fiscal conservative perspective, there's a way better way for us to handle this, save money, and do it in a way that's compassionate, that we could not only feel better, we could actually do better. So there you go.
Can I add on to that? In terms of the studies that Chad's referring to, so that you can do the hard work of looking at them yourselves, it's not just Chad saying this. There are decades of studies that prove that same thing over and over again, that it's more cost effective to provide supportive housing to people who are chronically homeless than it is to leave them right where they are. And you can find links to those studies. Just some of them. I had 2 full-time MPA students and 1 part-time law student working for months to try and pull all these studies together, and they finally said, I can't get them all. Like, you're just going to have to deal with how many we collected at this point. There's so many studies that show that exact same thing that have been done by different, across the divide, private companies, think tanks, on the conservative side, on the liberal side, nonpartisan. It's all there for you to look at. And that's really important for us to focus on, because it takes, again, the emotion out of it. It doesn't matter what we think a particular person deserves. What matters is this is a problem we're all here to try and solve, and this is the most cost-effective way to do it. In fact, there's no intervention in all of housing and homelessness policy that has been studied as thoroughly as supportive housing, and it's been consistently shown to be the most cost-effective. And to Chris's point, where he was saying that some communities are making progress, there are a number of communities that have been making progress with respect to their chronically homeless populations, and that is one of the primary ways by which they do it.
Yeah, so I'm going to piggyback off of that because Seattle's budget, so first of all, to kind of give you some homeless numbers here, 77% of the homeless population within King County live in Seattle proper. And then when we are talking about unsheltered homeless, 80% of them, it is estimated, have concurrent mental health and or substance abuse issues. Yeah. Anyway, right, and so without these wraparound services, these are people that are not going to be able to hold a job, right? They have, you know, like one guy that I can think of, for example, was taking a bike, picking it up in the middle of Olive Way, throwing it down on the ground, picking it back up, throwing it back down on the ground, right? So I don't think he's going to, unfortunately, be able to hold down a job well. But the thing where you guys can get involved and where you can take action is demanding the city to release where they are spending their money. 2 years ago, they had a $54 million budget. We're now at $90 million per year. Additionally, King County has set aside, ending fiscal year 2018 for this year, they set aside $100 million for affordable housing and $230 million to help build places for the homeless to go, and to help with homeless services. And so when we have $330 million from King County and $90 million from Seattle, and it costs $60 million to build a 300,000 square foot dormitory-style housing. I talked to a construction guy last night to get those numbers. It's roughly $250 per square foot.
That's a good number. That's my industry. So,
Yeah.
cheers.
Right?
Fact check.
So, great. Right? So, 60 million. I think out of the over 400 million we have, and that's just public, right? This region is very generous in terms of donating to the homeless. That's where Chris's $1 billion number came from, out of the Puget Sound Business Journal. And so you guys need to look at where the money is going, and are those organizations being held accountable? There are certain organizations that have held on to property given to them freely by the city for the past 20 years to develop low-income housing, and they have not on certain properties. They're also hiding properties within shell companies. So just something for you to do your research on, and demand your city council members and Mayor Durkin to be accountable for that. That is your money, and right now, it's inhumanity happening on the streets, right? We're dealing with rat infestation. We are seeing diseases come back from sanitary issues. Typhus is hitting LA. Up here, well, in the north, they had an HIV outbreak right by the low barrier encampment. Right, and so there's also children in these encampments. Most of the women living there are domestic violence victims. There are assault victims. There's drug trafficking. I don't know if you guys just saw the news. They broke up a drug cartel that was operating in Pioneer Square. They found $20,000 in cash. So ask me if that's a housing affordability issue. That would pay for my rent for 3 years.
Those were house people.
I have roommates.
Those are people living in houses selling drugs.
Yeah, but the thing is, they're allowed to set up a base of operations within the city, right? To the point where we can no longer use the sidewalks. And when I wear open-toed shoes, I need to make sure I'm not going to step on needles because 2 of my neighbors stepped on needles in their yards. So that's a problem. Yeah,
Right.
so pressure them. That's the whole point of this.
Chris, you had something to add?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I kind of took a smattering. 2 things. One is I'm always skeptical, respectfully, when someone says I'm data-driven and evidence-based. For these reasons, and I'll explain why. I would actually prefer if people are principles-driven, because I think the data can be massaged any which way. Evidence can be, I have great evidence, you have great evidence, but I think you really need to get firm on principles, because that's what leadership is about. That's what getting things done is about at the end of the day. And I think that if you look at it, I actually took the liberty of doing something incredibly boring so you don't have to. I looked at the strategic plans every year for like 20 years for the all home, one table, whatever it's called. They kind of keep shifting these same organizations, the kind of unified public strategy. I looked at two things. I looked what strategies are they proposing for the last 20 years, and who's on the board of these organizations. It's a recycling board of people with the same basic ideas year after year after year. In 2005, they set the goal to end homelessness altogether in 10 years. That was the Committee to End Homelessness. In 2015, they just rebranded. Said, oof, the Committee to End Homelessness did not end homelessness. Let's rebrand this effort. But if you look at the proposal, the same basic strategic direction was the same the whole time. And at that time, it was data-driven and evidence-based. I think you should trust the evidence of your own eyes and your own experience. Right? Okay, thank you. And I mean, I think there is some good evidence, there's some good data. I like to dig into it as well. But at the end of the day, when your actual day-to-day experience is screaming into your face, what we're doing is not working, you should trust yourself. And the fact is that we have a political class driven by ideology that stands now in opposition to the public. And I'll give you just a couple examples, and I think they're relevant. You had 70% opposition to the head tax. That went up to about 80%. You have one of the issues, 65% of people saying no more expensive bike lanes while we have a homelessness crisis, 65%. And you have 55% of Seattle voters, 92% of whom are Democratic voters. 55% now say we want a zero tolerance policy on homeless encampments. Provide services, provide mental health, provide rehab, but we have to start changing the policy direction fundamentally. So you have a broad majority of Seattle voters that have no representation, nobody advocating for them, and no one laying down an intellectual foundation for true policy change. It's evidence-based, data-driven solutions. It's the same boilerplate that hasn't worked year after year after year. So I think be skeptical, trust yourself, and demand that we go with a set of different controlling ideas and principles. If we want change, I think that's the direction it has to go.
So I'm always chomping at the bit to speak. Chris and I have to go out and get some drinks after this. So yes, of course, to the extent that your point is that there's a problem and we haven't been successful in solving it, then yes, obviously believe your eyes. But in terms of what the solutions are, I'm sorry, you have to look at what the evidence says works. If we try to lead and figure out what the solutions are by what our emotions are telling us, we are going to be in this exact same effing place 20 years from now. I tell you, I promise you that. So what we need to do, and some of the studies that I'm talking about, when you see the landslide of them, whatever the massaging is around the end, if you see a landslide of studies that are done by all these different groups who would have different incentives to massage the data different ways, and they all say the same thing, you gotta pay attention to that. So I agree. It's true that you can look with your own eyes and see that we've not solved chronic homelessness. One more thing, but we need to pay attention to the data that shows us the most cost-effective way to do it. One more thing I just wanted to point out is even in this discussion, we've gone back to imprecision already, because that budget that was talked about, whether you agree or disagree with the Puget Sound Business Journals, it's about homelessness, right? And so to follow on Amber's recommendation, What you really want to know, I'm guessing, is that you want to know exactly what the city is doing to address unsheltered homelessness and how that's been proven to be successful. Because what we're doing right now, moving people from place to place, the interventions that we've all been doing right now aren't working. They're definitely not working. And so that's why I think we have to demand evidence-based interventions and to make sure that that particular population is being, those interventions are being well-funded. Because I'll tell you that one point, however many $1 billion it is, that's not going to address chronic homelessness. It's not going to supportive housing. It's going to some important things. We have had actually some progress with respect to homeless families and children and veterans. Right? So we know that some of those interventions are actually working, but it confuses us, right? Because we see all these numbers and people are throwing terms around, and then you see with your own eyes that unsheltered homelessness, we're not making progress there. So just wanted to add those refinements.
So I think a lot of people in the crowd are probably putting together this distinction from what we just heard, that there's a technical aspect and then there's the political implementation. And it seems like there's a gap between the two right now. Are people kind of picking up on that? And so does anyone, and this is for the entire panel, have a remediation for that? We've got a council race coming up. We've talked about that, but we seem to get similar faces and ideology. So this might be a good one for the business community who's been taking some leadership on this issue. So.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that was really, last year was, you know, what next? Clearly, we've got an issue. We had division. We have a city divided. And really, that was the whole foundation of the third door was an alternative pathway to say, hey, let's look at collaboration. Let's look at one focus area that's ripping our city apart. And every person up here has said, if you're going to provide housing and services is what you do. You can't just leave people on the streets to their own devices. You can't just allow just wild stuff to happen. And that group isn't going back to work for the most part. And those services that are provided, they cost us a tremendous amount of money. And so the game changer, and I saw All Home and all those things, and I think the difference is right now the business community is starting to re-engage, and we've been part of that conversation to say, okay, what do we do? Because this is an existential economic threat to our region and our city if we don't figure out how to deal with this, right? And we can wait for an election. Good luck. We can wait for the tide to turn by just pouring in money, or we could start to engage with Chamber, DSA, Visit Seattle, ourselves, service providers, others, neighborhoods to talk about bringing people off the street and wrapping them with services so that they're not basically causing all the issues on the streets. And so I think the real difference is, yeah, from the housing perspective, and that business leadership in every community where the conversation has changed, business drove it. Drove it from the sense that they stepped up and said, we need to do something different. And so for anybody that's been involved or understands affordable housing development in these other areas, and even supportive housing development, one of the things we're doing as Third Doors is questioning the cost drivers. Like, why does it cost $300,000 to build a unit? What is market driven? How could we change that so that we could deliver a solution that costs a heck of a lot less money from a capital perspective and then saves us money from an operating perspective? If you look at the healthcare costs, I mean, Harborview right now underwrites nursing services and doctor services for supportive housing because it's a heck of a lot cheaper for them to send people on site to housing than to stuff our emergency room services. So I think business leadership, not attacking business as the source of the problem. And that's, I mean, I have no love for the city council, and everybody knows that. It's not like it's a big secret, right? I'm like a pro-market capitalist pig. I own like 13 businesses. But I want effective solutions. I'm tired of fighting about stuff, right? I want to actually get to the meat and deliver, right? Because I got kids too. I cleaned up 520 and I-5, right, with the encampments and needles and those elements. And I don't want to live in a city like that, so I'm not giving up. And I'm not somebody that's just a foundation person that's writing big checks. And I'm actually somebody engaged with a whole lot of other business leaders and service providers and researchers. And by the way, we're not even a nonprofit. We don't even have, it's just a volunteer group that's made a tremendous difference. So I think that's part of is a groundswell of business leadership, community, neighborhood. Because I don't know about you, I'm not waiting for the politicians to solve this.
I know, I like that answer a lot, and I think that's really inspiring for all of us. There's a lot of leadership in that kind of forgotten middle that you represent. You're not a plutocrat dropping, $1 million checks on the issue. You're boots on the ground. You can rally people around and create strategic partnerships around it. Chris, I'd love to hear from you. I know you're ready to talk about. There's huge amounts of dollars still being spent, though, by the politicians. So, and there seems to be this general resentment of this community that a lot of us are a part of, representing leadership from a business standpoint. So, where's that disconnect? The head tax didn't pass. It was pushed through by activists, by the council, who I have no love for as well. How do you resonate, or how do you reconcile that difference between the business community that's trying to lead, but the elected class that resents that leadership and that vitality we have in the region?
Yeah, I think I would disagree. I think that at the heart, this is almost solely a political problem. And I think that we need to get people off the streets. We need to get people who are, let's say, a 65-year-old man with 20 years on the street and he's a chronic alcoholic. We've got to get him in that kind of supportive housing. There's no other way for that. But there is another subset of people on the streets that are 25, shooting dope and robbing the QFC in Ballard. This is another very predominant element that we have to deal with, and business can't really deal with it, only to a certain extent. You'll notice that on 3rd and Pine, it's kind of a show, right? If you walk 3 blocks north into South Lake Union, you'll never see a tent. You'll never see someone shooting up. You'll never see someone doing that kind of lifestyle, because Amazon very quietly has their own private security that tells people, you can't do that here, keep moving. So I think we need to, if we can keep Amazon's campus clean, if we can keep Laurelhurst clean, if we can keep Broadmoor clean, why can't the city offer that same kind of protection and quality of life policing to every neighborhood in this city, including the neighborhoods that are hardest hit and the most disadvantaged? Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, there is a law enforcement element that we don't want to talk about in Seattle, but it's going to be a requirement, because you have to set the standard equal to other communities, or you're creating an imbalance that no matter how many housing units you build, no matter how much compassion you show, you're going to be having people coming to Seattle because of the policy environment. I think safe injection sites are a huge draw. The academic studies, I think the evidence is pretty good that over 10 years after they put in the safe injection facility in Vancouver, the number of people who were what are now being called opioid migrants went from 20% to more than 50% of the population in the area around the safe injection site. So at the end of the day, it's a policy question, it's a law enforcement question. We have half the number of police officers per capita compared to Boston and New York. 50%. While at the same time, our crime rate is our property crime rate is 400% higher than New York. There's a huge disconnect between those two numbers, and we need to, people who need help, that want help and need help, we should be throwing every dollar, every resource, every service to them to help. But people who don't want help, people who want to live on the streets, in the encampments in Ballard, in Fremont, down by the canal, and they just want to do that, we have to have some kind of humane, compassionate law enforcement response, or we're not going to truly solve the problem, not only for the homeless, but for all of you, for neighbors. I think in this debate, sometimes we focus so much on the most kind of tangible element of suffering, but someone should be advocating for neighbors. Because if you live in Ballard, if you live in Soto, if you live in these other places, it's getting harder and harder and harder. And I think that neighbors are crying out for some sort of law enforcement. It can't be that you call the cops and they come 6 hours later. That's not acceptable. It can't be, and I agree on the sweeps. We're sweeping people from here to there, to there, to there. It's like whack-a-mole, and it's not working, but we need to create an environment citywide where we don't tolerate, we can say, hey, we have services available, we have emergency-style shelter facilities that we can build rapidly. San Diego built 900 shelter beds in I think, less than 60 days, using no public money. It was all philanthropic and corporate money. But they had some political leadership that was willing to go to the mat and start enforcing the law. And I think that at the end of the day, we're not going to solve this problem with housing alone. Even with the full head tax, I crunched the numbers, it would have taken 50 years to provide enough housing for all 12,000 people homeless in King County. I don't think we have that long to wait.
All right, so this is a question for the entire panel, and this is one that kind of speaks to the heart and the ideology in our city. So the Seattle is Dying documentary spoke to people in the neighborhoods based on what Chris was just saying, who are struggling to reconcile the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent, homeless people are still suffering, there's a lack of compassion in the streets, and property crime is still on the rise. So think of that as one side of the conversation. There was another side, Tim Harris, for instance, founder of Real Change, that really positively impacts people's lives in our city. He called that same documentary misery porn, or a hit piece on homelessness. And former Washington State legislator Jessalyn Farrow on Twitter called the documentary a piece of right-wing propaganda. That's a huge divide between how people view the same documentary that many of us saw. So let's start on this side, or whoever wants to take that one. How are people seeing that so differently, the same piece?
Well, I have a microphone, so I'm going to answer.
There you go.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I was in it. It's fine. It was from a Ballard Town Hall like a year prior, and I was like, oh, that's me. Great. That was me. So that was me acknowledging that. So Seattle leadership, you will not hear them say that there's an opioid epidemic unless they are trying to get money. And so, if I don't know who saw the Civic Cocktail last week with Pete Holmes. He is your city attorney for the city of Seattle. He said that it is not a drug problem that we're seeing with many people on the streets. Unfortunately, he signed 2 legal documents, Seattle versus Purdue and King County. He may not have signed the King County one versus Purdue. In there, the city of Seattle, including Pete Holmes, claimed that the large amount of problems that we're having, and he said both for the opioid epidemic and for property crimes and for garbage cleanup, is because of drugs. So I don't really actually know where he stands because he said 2 different things. One's on a legal document and one was at the Civic Cocktail. So, you can watch it. It's on YouTube. But the deal is we'll never be able to house enough people if people keep coming here. There is such a thing as opioid tourism. And so people migrate to where it's allowed. The Mexican cartels went on National Geographic and said, hey, we're in Seattle because we won't get in trouble. That's a problem. And so, yes, we have chronic homeless, but we also have a section of people that are enjoying the freedom of not being put in jail. I mean, I hate to say that that's true. There are different diversion programs. LEAD is one of them, where, I understand having mercy for people who are doing small crimes, but when you have an offender who has committed domestic violence, assaults, and he's on his 70th conviction, right? Why is he back on the street, right? Who is the next victim? And on top of that, when I talked to Adrian Diaz, he is one of the assistant chiefs of police. His biggest safety concern for the public right now is the rebar that supports I-5. It is in danger of being melted from people cooking meth in barrels, and they can't do anything about it. So that is a problem, and that's also why they sweep. So you may not agree with the sweeps, but if they were not to do that, rats, needles pile up, and they set up center of operations for drugs. So, right, so what do we do in the short term? I don't know. And then, sorry, I need to answer the question. Yeah, Seattle is dying is polarizing because you have your ideology, and when your ideology doesn't match what you see, you have a crisis of sorts, right? And so it's either you can believe your ideology or you can believe what you see on the streets. And I think it's a big problem when our leaders, they want to try experimental solutions, right? Safe injection sites, instead of putting money into drug rehab. So I personally know someone who was waitlisted in rehab, and he is now no longer here. He was shot and killed breaking into a home for heroin. So I'm not saying circumstances would have changed, but we need to not have wait lists to get into rehab. Like, where's that shell money that they have right now, like, set aside for whenever that they feel that they can get away with having a safe injection site, they could be using for rehab right now. Let's use the money we have.
So, Sarah, what do you think?
One of the risks we have in tackling a topic like this in, an hour and a half, is there's no fucking way that we're going to work all this out in this period of time. And all we've been able to do is scratch enough to sort of agitate and even possibly confuse. And so what even as I'm listening, I'm like, I could talk, I feel like I could reach out and make a connection to each of you to explain something that was said in a way that would make sense to you. But when we throw around a lot of stuff, and I didn't come here to impugn community organizers. I didn't come here to impugn politicians. I came here to invite you to continue to work on this with me. Chad and I are living proof. He reminds me all the time he loves capitalism, and he's telling me all the things that, and we don't have the same ideological. We work together constantly, and he's not the only one. So if you're feeling confused or agitated or angry or frustrated, I get it. All of us feel that way, regardless of where you are politically or ideologically. All of us feel that way. The only way we're going to work through this is if we can figure out a way to stop making this as polarizing as possible, to use Chad's adage, to stop complaining and start doing. If you're interested in engaging with me, with the Third Door, to go tour a supportive housing unit. Use your own eyes. See why these approaches are the most effective way to address chronic homelessness. I want to invite all of you not to have this be the beginning and end of the time and effort that you commit to this really crucial issue. It really just needs to be an invitation to continue to really do some hard work, and I'm ready to do it with you.
Sarah, you stole my last question because it was focused on solutions, so good work. Chad, do you have anything to add? Maybe talk about, for the audience, supportive housing, like what is it exactly? Like paint the picture when someone walks in the door for us.
Yeah, so the idea behind supportive housing is that, for drug rehab and all these things that we do have some services that are limited, a lot of the times they go through those things, and then when it's all over, they get popped back out on the street. And so we actually end up wasting the money, the recidivism and the going back is not effective at all. So supportive housing is basically the idea that to give people not just shelter, because a shelter is basically a bed, they don't really have a home, that a home is a place that could just be a studio apartment. It's a place that you start to build, rebuild and have safety. So if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We just go back to like business school and some of our psychological texts.
Everybody had to learn it, no matter what.
Yeah. So it's all that base level, which is the physiological needs. Until those are taken care of, you can't go to the next level. So we're asking people, and I've been out on UGM where you're trying to get people to come in. They're in such bad shape. You're asking them to make higher level decisions and self-actualization in those pieces. Supportive housing brings them in and then wraps them with services, right? Allows them the option to do those things. And once they're in, it's like a 94% retention rate. They stay in housing. So instead of going back into a camp after rehab or any of these other things, they're actually housed, right? And so, yeah, they stay there. So a 94% retention rate on those things. So it costs anywhere between $18,000 to $20,000 to house them. Again, 3 days in Harborview. That's what it costs in Harborview for 3 days. 3 months in jail, low level, $18,000. 1 year in a home, $18,000, $20,000.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, that's the equation right there. So I want to save some time for questions. I know there's some out there. We have either a floating mic, or if you're loud, then feel free. Let's go right here for the first one.
Yeah, just a general question, a principal question, and an evidence-based question. Principal question is, how do you tell someone who doesn't want to go into a house to go into a house? Mental health, schizophrenia, personality disorders. I'm guessing the other side is saying you can't force people to do what they don't want to do. And when there's mental health illness, it's hard to force people to do something that they don't want to do. And personal autonomy in a lot of different parts of our society takes precedence over policy or public policy, whether it's immunizations, whether it's housing. So that's the first question. The second question is, you mentioned San Diego. What other practical solutions do cities have that we're trying to model towards? I've seen a lot of news about San Francisco, and I think we're steering away from that example. But what are some practical examples of what we're moving towards from other cities? Thanks.
So on that was an awesome question. I'm a professor, I'm used to yelling. That was an awesome question, really good question. First thing I would say is that most people, even if they'll turn down services, offers of service or treatment or shelter, will accept offers of housing. They will accept offers of housing. In fact, we just checked in today with a service provider for supportive housing. He said their wait list is like a mile long. Why is there a mile long wait list for people who these are people who qualify for supportive housing? A mile long wait list, and there's not enough places to send them. So that's one thing. I also think, though, that you uncovered a nugget that Chris palpated earlier. I'm using all these medical terms. I think we do have to have a conversation about what happens with people who would otherwise qualify for supportive housing and don't accept it. But I will tell you, we literally just had this conversation with a bunch of service providers today who said that is a very small, very, very small number, and there's actually a much larger number of people who would take it if it were available. It's not available.
I'll jump in on that for just 1 second, and we'll let Chris pop in. So with UGM, there's a gentleman named Red there, and I had lunch with Red with a number of other business leaders, and Red was really fascinated by what Third Door was doing and talked about supportive housing, and he's like, Chad, he's a survivor. He's 20 years on the street, shotguns, heroin dealer. I mean, like he's everything you'd never want anybody to be. He's recovered. He's rebuilding his life. And he's like, Chad, everybody I know would take housing. What they don't want is the shelter. Some of these places are not places people want to be. But every one of them, maybe 98%, would actually, we're not offering housing. We're offering things with a bunch of strings right now.
And supportive housing, by the way, those are leased units. Supportive housing is not free. They're leased units. The people who go into supportive housing pay 30% of their income. Now, their income is usually in the form of disability or Social Security, but they have skin in the game. These are leased units, and so they don't just get to waltz in and do whatever the hell they want. They are tenants.
Yeah, and I think I'll add from my research and talking to the panel also that shelters are not a sustainable option for this community. It's managing the issue, but it's not solving it. There's barriers for a lot of people in that pets, possessions, not being able to be with your partner. Those are all issues that.
I have to split from my 15-year-old son.
Yeah, from children, exactly. So those are all headwinds for people getting into the housing as well. So right in the back.
Yeah, you mentioned that we have permanent supportive housing right now, and we also are seeing a chronic homeless population. How much housing do we have, and how much do we need? That's the part I'm confused on.
You want to answer that question? We actually know the answer to that question because we've spent 9 months studying it.
Yeah, so I think there's approximately, in King County, there's about 4,100 of existing units. And if you look at the population of chronic homeless, about 29% in King County, there's about a delta of about 4,000. So if you go over about 5 years, there's 8,000 units total needed. We've got about 4,200, I think, currently and some planned. So there's a big delta. It's been growing since 2005. So.
Right here.
So Chris, you talked about using the examples of private security, which would patrol an area and then sort of make activities that are not wanted go other places. But you also talked about sweeping and how playing the boat where you're poking holes in it. So I'm wondering how those two things go together. How do you make a solution instead of just making people move along?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's the paradox that we're in. You can't do one or the other. You really need to do both. I think a responsible plan, I mean, we declared a state of emergency 3 years ago now. What happens when you declare a state of emergency? What's the first thing that happens? There's a tornado, there's a hurricane.
Money.
There's a money bomb that gets dropped, and we've done that. You have emergency shelter facilities. And yeah, it's not a long-term solution, but you have to get people triaged, and you have to give people somewhere to go. And I think we need to make some supportive housing definitely, but that's not the solution for everyone. And I think what we've done now is we're doing the sweeps, which maybe have some benefits. I think that's good. I mean, certainly near the elementary school where one of my oldest kids goes, there was a 45-tent homeless encampment that was 100 yards away. That's not good. We can't have that. It grew for almost a year before it was swept. So that's good in a sense, but where are you sweeping people to? And I think that's a valid criticism that people are making, let's say, on the more activist side. But you have to first create enough emergency shelter facilities so that you can give people an option. You have a place to go. It's not a great place. We're not putting you up at the Four Seasons, but it is a place to go to be housed in an emergency way, triaged. Do you have family? That's one thing we haven't talked about at all, which is astonishing. It's like, do you have family? Do you have any resources? Do you have a cousin that will take you in? Do you have someone that will help? Can we get you a bus ticket to wherever you are from? Is there an opportunity for you there? Do you need immediate medical attention? Do you need to get a psychiatric evaluation? And then maybe start thinking statewide about conservatorships. Because if you're a schizophrenic heroin addict that is beating yourself in the face on the streets every day, it's not compassionate or fair to let that go on. It's actually a really cruel thing. But you have to really do both. You have to have this kind of proactive community policing, quick response, and then give people the option. You need to go somewhere where we can help you. And then if you refuse help, there's a lot of cities are kind of dealing with that question, right? I don't want to go anywhere. And in Seattle, we're saying, all right, sounds good. The fact is that 63 or 66% of the people that are made contact by navigation teams during sweeps refuse all services. Yeah, if you give them an apartment and they can continue to shoot up, like they'll take it. But that's going to be a long-term, massive investment, and we need to create change more quickly. And I think so you create enough emergency shelter facilities quickly. You could do it with a very small amount of money, private donations, philanthropic business donations, and then you can start enforcing the law in compliance with the constitutional kind of limits. You have to give people an option. But my concern with the permanent supportive housing model, it's not for everyone, and it's going to take a decade or more, even under the rosiest assumptions. And what do we do in the interim? And are we sure that we're not just going to be continuing to bring people into Seattle at a faster rate than we're getting them housed? And then Seattle is bearing the burden for King County, for Washington State, for other parts of the country. And I don't think that's fair to anyone here. So, good question.
Sorry, I'm going to add one more thing. The navigation team cannot sweep unless they can offer each person that they're sweeping a place to stay.
That's not true. That's not true. That's what they're doing now. I know there's an MDAR, and this was just reported that that's part of the mayor's plan is to step it up. It used to be the rule, but it's not true that they have to do that.
So I've not heard that. And last time I talked to Adrian Diaz, he told me that they could not sweep unless due to the ACLU injunction.
Yeah, Zerg will tell you that they don't have to.
So it sounds like our leaders once again have conflicting statements between who she talked to and who I talked to. So worth to investigate.
So I worked in low-income housing for a while. I was a case manager actually for 63 families. And I have a couple of questions, one of which is just to, touch on what you've already said, that it is such a complicated issue because there are so many different kinds of people that are homeless. And that could be the woman escaping domestic violence with her 3 kids. That could be the gentleman with mental health issues. That could be a veteran. That could be any age, any race, any, come from any different kind of past. And so I worked in permanent affordable housing that was a housing first model. So there were lower barriers to entry, so to speak. And my questions are, with incentive structure, is when you have permanent affordable housing, I saw every different kind of situation. So I saw someone that came into my office and wanted everything for free. And, I said, well, how are you planning on paying your rent next month? Because Catholic Community Services can only cover you this month. He said, well, I could work for 2 days and pay my rent. It's no big deal. I said, well, then why aren't you? What can I do to help you get there? And then I had a woman with 4 children that was escaping a domestic violence situation. That it was the biggest game changer that her children were in a safe environment and they were going to a good school. And she would cry in my office about how incredible this opportunity was. And her little boys would come and visit me every day and just be so grateful. And so you have this wide array, and then they're living right next to each other. And they're in apartments where you have a veteran that has PTSD next to a 5-year-old's bedroom who wants to bang on the walls. And it's causing all of these issues. And, marijuana smoke, or whatever you want to call it, is going underneath the walls into the child's bedroom from a guy that needs it for medical issues next to a 5-year-old. And just the level of complexity with that, and then also addressing just how much affordable housing we would have to have, and then the fact that as a magnet, we really can't house everybody. So we could be building buildings constantly. We could be lowering, the barriers to entry for well-intentioned builders to build these apartment buildings, but if we're attracting people from all over the country, it's never going to be enough. And then it becomes a question also of just low-income people versus mental health issues and how we're addressing mental health. And honestly, sticking someone that has serious mental health issues into an apartment building, while that may feel good and we might not see them anymore, that's not addressing the deeper issue. So.
It is a bit the complexity piece, you're 100% right, and that's why we started the conversation. I was like, we really need to define what we're talking about here. And my assumption was we're talking about unsheltered chronic homelessness because that's what people see. But you're right, it's incredibly complex. Also, the idea of affordable housing is, a lot of people don't understand the difference between affordable housing and, and I just was talking to her, I forgot about everybody else. a lot of people don't understand the difference between affordable housing and supportive housing. So the example you gave, the idea of someone who's typically chronically homeless suffers from co-occurring disorders of a severe mental illness or mental illness and substance use disorder, quite common to have those co-occurring. You can't just give that person an apartment. But what you do give them is supportive housing, which has the caseworkers to make sure that they're being good tenants, help them figure out things like stay on them. But the vast majority of those people can't get jobs. So the employment issue, it becomes complicated if we try to solve it all at once. And so we have to have some sympathy for how difficult this problem is for our politicians and our policymakers to solve. I don't question anybody's good intentions. Whether you are the same Democratic or Republican Party or whatever it is, I don't question anybody's good intentions. But that's why I say we really have to be really careful about what we're defining. I think figuring out how to have those conversations about specific subgroups so that we can say, aha, for that group, we know based on our experience and evidence, this is the most effective intervention, and try and tackle it like that. Like you have to win smaller pieces of it, because otherwise to say how are we going to solve homelessness is far too complex of a question. And Chad, you had an idea about the magnet theory. We have supportive housing already, and it hasn't caused people to come running. Areas that have supportive housing that have had a lot of it have not experienced a huge influx of people. But Chad actually this is one of the nice things about partnering with business people who think about stuff I don't think about, had an idea in terms of coming up with new supportive housing and making sure that we have good data on the magnet theory.
Yeah, no, I think so first of all, thank you for I don't know if you still do casework, but that is, I know it's brutal, it's difficult. And what we've been talking about for supportive housing is really around, pretty hard chronic homeless. You would not mix them in multifamily in typical deals. So as to address some of the other issues, I am somebody that wants to challenge the cost-driving assumptions. So when you talk about affordable housing, I think about all of the tax incentives and all the things that are going around that. I want to break that model for supportive housing and see how we could drive down those costs and build it for far less, far faster, and break some rules to make that happen. And Third Door is all about that, challenging the assumptions. Part of having a public-private partnership is let's set up some data gathering and evidence gathering. So partnering with maybe organizations like Tableau that have done a great job of data visualization and transparency around the country for other efforts to find out, do we have a problem that people are coming? Right now, I don't think a lot of people trust some of the sources of those. So let's build that as a business community. Let's demand as business and voters that let's make sure that that data is accountable and that we have transparency of how that's collected and done. And then we can make good decisions if that's actually the case, right? And so we're not out with our full plan yet, but I think you're going to see what I think the incredible part is this region has such great innovation, and that's something that we want to bring to this as well. Yes, 10 years ago they declared they're going to end all homelessness. Well, that isn't really going to happen, right? There are certain circumstances that people are going to fall into. The question is, how do we impact it so that we have the least amount of chronically homeless on the streets, and that we make other homelessness brief and non-recurring? So I don't know if that answers a little bit, but yeah, we would not talk about putting somebody that's been on the street 20 years, schizophrenic, in with family units. That's just, that is not what the supportive housing model does.
Great. We have time for one more question. Did you have a question, sir?
Yes.
All right. I'll give you the mic.
Thanks. I don't know if it's a question or more of a statement, but for the last few years, Seattle has been all carrot and no stick. We are depolicing our city. Our SPD staffing levels are where they were in the 1970s. We had a story, just one of thousands, but last summer, just down the street there at the Target, this homeless gentleman went in there after robbing Columbia, got a big duffel bag. He ran into the Target. He rampaged through that store for 15 minutes in the middle of the day, breaking open cases, stealing iPhones and iPads, like thousands of dollars. He was taking the cases and throwing them down the escalator at people. No cops no cops came. Everyone was calling 911. No one came. And so these people know they can come here and get away with what they want and live like that. We have to turn the spigot off. And so, I hear a lot of talk about affordable housing and housing first and whatnot. You have to look at both sides. We can't just say, oh, we're criminalizing homelessness if we actually enforce our law. We have to have civility. This is no way to run a city, all right? And let's first thing we should do when we hopefully get a brand new and much different city council is we should do an audit of every department in the city and figure out where we're wasting money. Start with figuring out maybe, building this affordable housing in the middle of downtown and some of the most desirable neighborhoods is not the most effective use of that money. Is there cheaper real estate we could do that and still help these people? So I guess that's my question. Thanks.
Where was the question? I think that's actually a good entree. Do you want to talk about there's that nuance again within the populations? And
I'll pop in for a moment because one of the other disclosures is I'm on the Visit Seattle Board. I've been for over a decade. I actually co-chair the Street Civility Task Force. We work with DSA and others, and we've underwritten the Prolific Offenders Report. And we are working on how do you deal with the criminal element, both violent criminals and what is happening with those. So we have actually I have worked on both sides, which is how do we deal with chronic homeless, getting them off the streets, and then how do we deal with the criminal element, the downtown, right? So it's an and deal, right? Because just being homeless doesn't mean you're a criminal, right? And there are some low-level property crimes and low-level pieces, but I'm not here to defend violent criminals. You need to pay for what you've done. Right? There are repercussions to actions that do occur, right? So that's not where I'm at. And so we have both to work out. And that's why it's not one solution, right? It's an and solution. We need to do this, and we need to do this, and we need to do this. If you talk to the police, yeah, they're frustrated. Because if they go out for the chronic homeless, they're like, well, what do we do with them? Oh, we can arrest them and throw them in jail. Okay, well, that costs you a lot of money, right? Versus the criminal element. And I think people are right to ask, why aren't some of these people being arrested that are violent criminals? Or some other method if they're in such a state that they're actually, maybe there's, I forget what it's called, but involuntary commitment, right? Some other things where they're in such bad shape that they're a danger to themselves. So.
I know we're wrapping up, and I just wanted to, I'm going to say it again until somebody takes me up on it. It's what happened to Chad earlier, but I don't want this to be the end of the conversation. I think as far as I'm concerned, if you are open to thinking about things differently, I know I've learned a lot from Chad. That means that I have to be open to thinking about things differently. If you're committed to focusing on mutual interest, if you want to see solutions and stop complaining, I'm your girl. I want to work with you. I will put in the time and energy to work with you. If you're not in that camp, then there's plenty of places you can go to complain, and you're going to be part of the problem. So I hope that a lot of you will decide to get activated by this and to move towards solutions. And I would appreciate that.
yeah, great.
Yeah, so,
Well, Chris wants the mic. Amber.
yeah,
We're
so
going down the line.
I'm assuming we're now on to how you can be a part,
Yep,
right?
solutions,
And
yes.
solutions. Yeah, so we know certain demographics that are likely to end up on the street. We know that foster children, when they age out of the system, for example, 20 to 25% of them end up on the streets. We also know that domestic violence victims end up on the streets. And we also know that women who are in prostitution end up on the streets. And so there are a plethora of organizations that you can get involved in, right? So I mean, I could sit up here all day and name them all, right? So like the ones that I'm specifically involved in would be REST, Rescue Freedom, UGM's Hope Place. Mary's Place does great work with families in particular. So there are a lot of organizations, like we're not up here trying to doom and gloom you, but there are a lot of private organizations that are doing a lot of work. And then also look at a lot of Title I schools, the youth. If you can engage with them, like when they're in middle school, it shows that throughout the years, they're less likely to end up in trouble or on the streets. So there's other programs that work specifically at Title I schools. So those are typically underfunded, the poorer communities, more diverse communities. So After School All-Stars. I mean, there are a lot of different organizations. And you can also volunteer your time. And UGM has search and rescue vans at night. I've done a lot of those. Right? Because people are building relationships with people on the street, right, where they know them by name. But the hard truth is when I did the UGM search and rescue vans is a lot of people have a lot of the chronic have a lot of mental health issues. Whether or not it was because of substance abuse, I don't really care. But, you know, they tend to be a little bit more service resistant. And so it's really just kind of taking time out of your day and taking action. You can either donate your money or your time, or help in the foster care system, because Washington State is not doing very well there.
All right, great. Well, I'd like to close my comments. I'd like to launch into a defense of Seattle is dying, a defense of polarization, and a defense of emotion. This is probably the only room that I could get away with that in Seattle tonight. But the reason I think Seattle is dying was a huge community service. Not because it's the best documentary ever made, or it's completely accurate, or balanced, or whatever the other criticisms were, but I think what it did is it cut through some deeply problematic taboos that we have in Seattle. It opened up a real conversation for the first time in many years. And I think there's a great social critic named Christopher Lasch, and he wrote in the 90s, I think it's totally true now in this case, that democracy is not about information. Democracy is founded on debate. And debate means polarization. It means your idea versus my idea. Let's put them head to head and may the best idea win. Not polarization between people.
I think you define polarization differently.
Okay.
We can debate.
Sure.
And not be polarized. If we're polarized, we're not listening to each other.
Sure. Yeah.
No, I think that's fair. I think
Yeah.
listening is a key vital component of all
Sure,
that.
but I think it's actually about debate, and we seem to be allergic in this city to anything resembling a conflict of ideas. But if you look at American history, right? Let's just look at American history. Any positive social change first comes from emotion, and then comes from debate, and then comes from trying to create change because you're passionate about it. And I don't think we should back away from that. I don't think emotion is always bad. I think that it can inform a lot of action. And I think that debate is critical. That's the one thing that we don't have. We seem to come up with a consensus that fails year after year after year, and then we say, well, if we're nicer to each other next year, it's really going to start working. And I don't accept that. I actually think that we can have civil debate among people that we have mutual respect, but we can actually go at it with new ideas. Because the ideas that we have right now haven't worked in the past, they're not working now, and they're not going to work in the future. And I think that we need to look at Seattle is dying as a moment where go at it. You can attack it. You can criticize it. You know, when I talked to the folks, I mean, there was a whole media campaign to attack and undermine this documentary. But if you look at it, the reason why it has 2-3 million views on YouTube, it was talked about all over the nation because it struck at the heart of a truth that people feel and understand in their experience, but we're too scared to talk about. And the reporter, Eric Johnson, is not a Republican. He's just a citizen that was fed up, who wanted to make a difference, who wanted to speak the truth. He paid a personal cost for that. And I think that we need to look at it and say, what is driving such huge reaction? Because I did a little experiment. His thing went crazy on social media, on YouTube, everywhere, and all of the attacks against him, 2 shares, 3 shares, hundreds of articles that had no emotion. And I think it speaks to the people in the city that feel like nobody is listening to them. They're going to get attacked if they speak out. They're going to cancel your event at Peddler Brewing because a bunch of idiots on Twitter are attacking people. And this is the problem in our city. We can go through the technical analysis all day, but until we have new ideas and a new spirit of civic debate, it's not going to go anywhere. We're going to be building housing, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to truly make a difference. So I think that, polarization is okay as long as it's in the spirit of civic debate, as long as it's in the spirit of dialogue, as long as it's done with mutual respect, and as long as it's about the substance. And I think that we have room in this town for a little bit more of that.
All right, so that is our debate. Let's give all the panelists a really warm round of applause. Discussion.